Met Office set up a climate modelling unit which provided the basis for a new international committee called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
They came out with the first big report which predicted climatic disaster as a result of global warming. I remember going to the scientific press conference and being amazed by two things. First, the simplicity and eloquence of the message and the vigour with which it was delivered. And secondly, the total disregard of all climate science up till that time, including, incidentally, the role of the sun, which had been the subject of a major meeting at the Royal Society just a few months earlier.
But the new emphasis on man-made carbon dioxide as a possible environmental problem didn't just appeal to Mrs. Thatcher.
It was certainly something very favourable to the environmental idea, what I call the medieval environmentalism of let's get back to the way things were in medieval times and get rid of all these dreadful cars and machines. They loved it because carbon dioxide was for them an emblem of industrialization.
Well, carbon dioxide clearly is an industrial gas and tied in with economic growth, with transportation in cars, with what we call civilization. And there are forces in the environmental movement that are simply against economic growth. They think that's bad.
It could be used to legitimize a whole suite of myths that already existed: anti-car, anti-growth, anti-development, and above all, anti that great Satan, the US.
Patrick Moore is considered one of the foremost environmentalists of his generation. He is co-founder of Greenpeace.
The other reason that environmental extremism emerged was because world communism failed, the wall came down, and a lot of peaceniks and political activists moved into the environmental movement, bringing their neo-Marxism with them, and learned to use green language in a very clever way to cloak agendas that actually have more to do with anti-capitalism and anti-globalization than they do anything with ecology or science.
The left have been slightly disoriented by the manifest failure of socialism and indeed even more so of communism as it was tried out. And therefore they still remain as anti-capitalist as they were, but they have to find a new guise for their anti-capitalism.
And it was a kind of amazing alliance from Margaret Thatcher on the right through to very left-wing anti-capitalist environmentalists that created this kind of momentum behind a loony idea.
By the early 1990s, man-made global warming was no longer a slightly eccentric theory about climate. It was a full-blown political campaign. It was attracting media attention, and as a result, more government funding.
Prior to Bush the Elder, I think the level of funding for climate and climate-related sciences was somewhere around the order of $170 million a year, which was reasonable for the size of the field. It jumped to $2 billion a year, more than a factor of 10.
If I wanted to do research on, shall we say, the squirrels of Sussex, what I would do, and this is any time from 1990 onwards, I would write my grant application saying, I want to investigate the nut-gathering behavior of squirrels with special reference to the effects of global warming. And that way I get my money. If I forget to mention global warming, I might not get the money.
There's really no question in my mind that the large amounts of money that have been fed into this particular, rather small area of science have distorted the overall scientific effort.
Western governments have now embraced the need for international agreements to restrain industrial production in the developed and developing world. But at what cost? Paul Driesen is a former environmental campaigner.
My big concern with global warming is that the policies being pushed to supposedly prevent global warming are having a disastrous effect on the world's poorest people.
If you were to ask a rural person to define development, they'll tell you, yes, I'll know I've moved to the next level when I have electricity. Actually, not having electricity creates such a long chain of problems because the first thing you'll miss is the light. So you get that they have to go to sleep earlier because there's no light. There's no reason to stay awake. I mean, you can't talk to each other in darkness.
No refrigeration or modern packaging means that food cannot be kept. A fire in the hut is too smoky and consumes too much wood to be used as heating. There is no hot water. We in the West cannot begin to imagine how hard life is without electricity. The life expectancy of people who live like this is terrifyingly short, their existence impoverished in every way.
The question would be, how many people in Europe, how many people in the United States are already using that kind of energy? And how cheap is it? You see, if it's expensive for the Europeans, if it's expensive for the Americans, and we are talking about poor Africans, it doesn't make sense. The rich countries can afford to engage in some luxurious experimentation with other forms of energy. But for us, we are still at the stage of survival.
Let me make one thing perfectly clear. If we're telling the third world that they can only have wind and solar power, what we are really telling them is you cannot have electricity.
The challenge we have when we meet Western environmentalists who say we must engage in use of solar panels and wind energy is how we can have Africa industrialized. Because I don't see how a solar panel is going to power a steel industry, how a solar panel is going to power maybe some railway train network. It might work maybe to power a small transistor radio.
I think one of the most pernicious aspects of the modern environmental movement is this romanticization of peasant life and the idea that industrial societies are the destroyers of the world.
One clear thing that emerges from the whole environmental debate is the point that there's somebody keen to kill the African dream, and the African dream is to develop.
The environmental movement has evolved into the strongest force there is for preventing development in the developing countries.
We are being told, don't touch your resource, don't touch your oil, don't touch your coal. That is suicide.
I think it's legitimate for me to call them anti-human. Like, okay, you don't have to think humans are better than whales or better than owls or whatever if you don't want to, right? But surely it is not a good idea to think of humans as sort of being scum, that it's okay to have hundreds of millions of them go blind or die or whatever. I just can't relate to that.
British-based corporations are some of the worst climate criminals on the planet. Shell is based in the UK, right here in London. We have the right and the duty to take it back into public ownership, dismantle it, break it up, and send its managers to rehabilitation training.